Ideas are everything, and in the times that we're living, ideas for peace are essential. So in this video, we will discuss the most urgent problems with renowned scholars and discuss some of the solutions to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. So stay tuned for the interview that we prepare for you. Melania studied mechanical engineer at the University of Costa Rica and did her master's and PhD at the University of California on oceanography. She has worked at the NASA Johnson Space Center, has had the opportunity to work in the two poles, has presented her work at high-level conferences, and was recently named amongst Forbes' 100 most powerful women, and we have the honor of having her as an adjunct professor at UPeace. She has many interesting experiences to share with us, so we hope you enjoy this interview. Welcome, Melania, to Ideas for Peace.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited. As much as I love the polar regions, I also love being back here in the heat of Ciudad Colón in my native Costa Rica. It has been a really exciting trajectory, and only when I look back and when you mention it, I start connecting the dots. For sure, I had big dreams and aspirations of doing something that was very unique and different, and this combination of background and studies amounted to many adventures, and that's what I wanted. Initially, as a little kid, I dreamt of the people that went to space and the people that explored the bottom of the ocean, and I knew I wanted to go see things and places that look completely different than my native Costa Rica. And I achieved that through science. I first started understanding that all of these extreme environments were tied by technology, and that it was technology that allowed either a space shuttle to fly to orbit or a submarine to go to the bottom of the ocean. So I studied engineering in hopes of understanding those machines that allow us to survive those extreme conditions. And then I got to apply them in oceanography and specifically doing research in the Arctic. So I got to do about 10 years of field work in the Arctic. Every year I would navigate on ships in the Beaufort Sea or the Bering Strait and explore and get data and instrumentation out of the water and put instruments back in the water that would give us data to understand climate change in the Arctic. So all of this trajectory has combined both the technology aspect and the scientific aspect. And that then in the 2015, I had a switch to understanding more about geopolitics and diplomacy, because working in the Arctic, it's inevitable that you are dealing with a lot of conflict from countries that have interest, commercial interest, and political interest, strategic interests in that region. So I started understanding that there was also an aspect of interacting with different countries and decision-making at the international level that I wanted to be a part of.
While you were saying that you use technology and science, I was thinking about the project Howard Bound, that is one of the projects you participated in for Women in Sciences. So I wonder, what is the most difficult part of being a woman in the so-called hard sciences?
Well, it was interesting because I didn't really experience or understand that there was any discrimination or any aspect of being a minority until I entered the university here in mechanical engineering. I thought that all the girls also looked up to astronauts and Jacques Cousteau the way that I did. And once I got to engineering, I realized I was only among 4 women in 300 men. Wow. So there I started understanding that there were some barriers that they had not overcome, or they had not undergone the interest that I had experienced. So I definitely feel now that I have seen the different barriers and systematic barriers that exist, that it is my duty to work and lend a hand in helping more of those women first get interested and then also pursue that interest. And some of the barriers are as simple as not having role models to look up to the way that girls are socialized really early on, to stay in a comfort zone, to not get dirty, whereas we are raising boys to like take risks and jump higher and like jump farther and get dirty. So those things, the way that early childhood socializes girls differently, is still a barrier. And then later on, once we are inside of an environment like the academic environment, we see things about biases and stereotypes that continue to put women lagging behind, for example, their publications are not as cited as men publications. They get less funding in research grants. So there are still all these other barriers that prevent them from successfully completing a career like a man would. And the way this program, Homeward Bound, was born was exactly by women recognizing that if we group together and if we, like build a coalition of the women actually supporting each other, that we're going to get farther. So this program was born out of a leader who gives coaching to CEOs and, business top level, entrepreneurs that was realizing that women were not getting to those layers and those levels. So recognizing that and understanding that by just pushing a little bit more leadership skills into the women and giving them possibilities to be visible, and then also creating networks that they would support each other, that may be the thing that they needed for these women that were already highly trained and had a lot of knowledge, but were not elevated enough to get to decision-making places.
Is this connection also for the communication? You mentioned that in 2015 you realized that it was important to switch to the communication aspect. But was it parallel to what you were doing or something that just happened?
It's interesting because I think I had been exposed to the communication aspect really early on. I have a mom who's a teacher, a kindergarten teacher, so whenever she had to teach something about science, she would ask me to go and give outreach talks to her kids. So I developed the skills to talk to little kids very early on. And then there was a really big, important experience that I had after working at NASA. After being an undergrad, I worked at NASA for a year. After I returned from there, just 2 weeks later, we had the Space Shuttle Columbia accident. And I was called to go talk to the media and explain what was going on. So that experience also put me in contact with the media, TV, and understanding how I could translate my experiences and my knowledge for the understanding of other people became really, paramount in designing a career in science communication.
You also have experience with interface communication between decision makers to shape legal frameworks and policies related to climate change and ocean conservation. But what do you exactly mean about interface communication?
Well, I think it's important that in the middle, because scientists have a specific language and policymakers have a very distinct way of communicating as well, that somebody sits in the middle and allows a bridge to be built between the communities. With topics like climate change and sustainable development, things like those, that have to be decisions based on science and evidence, we need to get that knowledge that the academics have or the scientific community has into the hands of the decision makers. But how that transfer happens has to recognize that there is a barrier in between, because the languages are very different, because the way that they think is very different. Scientists think very long term and policymakers think very short term. So just like dealing with those barriers has to be interfaced by somebody who can accommodate the knowledge into the right hands at the right time. The timing is also very important, understanding the political role and the environment and who is the person that actually has the power to making a decision, then that becomes really important for there to be somebody that is trained specifically in that interface in the middle.
What is the most rewarding part of serving your country with your science background as an external advisor?
Yes, that transition actually started one particular day that I remember very well. I was doing work on a ship in the middle of the Bering Strait, and the Bering Strait is so narrow. People don't realize there's only 4 kilometers separating one island from Russia to an island from the US. So just understanding that there was so much connection between these two countries and that they could talk about the science that we were doing on the ship, but they could not talk about many other things. Just like they can talk and put a space station, in orbit, but they cannot sometimes talk about things that are happening on Earth. So understanding that and recognizing that I had a skill set that was unique, coming from a different country, speaking multiple languages, and having an interest in history and in geopolitics, I felt that was where my knowledge could best be served, especially when we have 10 years to make this quick turn in the way that global economics have put us on a path to climate change. So I recognized that, and I volunteered first to participate with the delegation of Costa Rica at the COP, at the climate conference every year, specifically being interested in fulfilling that space about connecting oceans with climate, which was largely a topic that was not getting talked about very much a few years ago. And thankfully, it's gotten a lot more traction. So 2 years ago, when Fiji became the presidency of the COP, it was the perfect timing to talk about oceans because, of course, these small islands are highly concerned about sea level rise, and they make a much more direct connection between oceans and climate. And then happily this last year, in 2019, Chile named their COP the Blue COP in recognition again of the largely forgotten topic of oceans. So I feel like my expertise is coming more and more handy in those spheres. And I have even started taking a master's course in diplomacy here at the Ministry of Foreign Relations to better understand again where those people come from, what language they're speaking, and how I can better serve with the wisdom and the scientific knowledge that I can provide.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what the blue economy is and how do you relate that to economy in general?
Well, the blue economy is a concept that evolves similar to the green economy from a few decades ago or years ago. And it just basically means to have an economy that is based on healthy, resilient oceans, to use the ocean without using it up. So how can we still fulfill those needs, societal needs about food and jobs in a way that provides the ocean the time and the protection it needs to still continue thriving and acting as a regulator of the climate the way that we have known it. So there are techniques and approaches that we can still use the ocean by still protecting it. So for example, marine protected areas, it's one of those mechanisms that allows us to have more catches. Downstream we're going to get more catches, and at the same time we're giving the ocean pieces and portions of time so that it can regenerate itself. So those approaches are highly successful in some islands, for example, in the South Pacific, where they protected initially a small portion and they had so many benefits that they suddenly increased the areas of protection because they have perceived the benefit to the communities. And the blue economy basically just wants to highlight that we can go now in two paths, and it's we are right now in this division of deciding what future we're going to give the ocean. We can get a future of sustainably using it in a blue economy way, or we can decide to keep using it and overfishing it and polluting it with plastics and just disregarding the indicators of acidification, for example, and then just go towards a path that accelerates climate impacts.
I have now two questions for you. One is related to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, because we know that oceans are part of this agenda. So I would like to know your thoughts about this agenda. Do you think it's feasible, or that indicators are adequate to achieve the goals, or not really?
Well, it's very interesting because differently than the Millennium Development Goals, at the beginning of the 2000s, this new Agenda 2030 has a specific sustainable development goal that is all about oceans. So SDG 14 is called Life Underwater. So it is great. It is a huge accomplishment, and you can tell the transition that we have gone from thinking that oceans were something separate from us to now thinking about oceans in a very concrete way in that agenda. So that is great, but in 2018, there was a big survey that was done on 3,500 world leaders, and they asked them to rank the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and SDG 14 was the one they ranked lowest at the very end. So there's still a lot of work to be done in evangelizing about SDG 14 and why it is important, because there is a lot of evidence that if you advance the different indicators of SDG 14, you can help and have co-benefits in other SDGs. So for example, SDG 1 and 2, poverty and hunger. You cannot address them if you don't have a healthy, sustainable ocean that is providing jobs, that is providing food, food security. So there is a high correlation between acting on SDG 14 and then fulfilling all the others. So it is really important, and I think the more we visibilize and demonstrate this link and make it personal to people, the more we can actually advance in all of the SDGs. And in fact, SDG 14, because of this reason, is the only one that has his very own ambassador. So there is one ambassador for SDG 14, and his name is Peter Thompson. He's a former diplomat from Fiji, and he travels the world talking to people exactly about this, why people should be looking and putting more funding into SDG 14.
I wonder, how do you transfer all your experiences and knowledge to your class? How is this beneficial for students?
I think that from the feedback I have gotten, from teaching these 2 times so far, they really love it when I inject personal experiences from doing research and personal stories of being, on a ship, and at the same time, in that context, explain what the system is, right? So when I talk to them about the COP, I don't just put a picture and list the different countries that are negotiating or the different treaties. I can actually tell them what it's like to be sitting in one of those rooms and the difficulties that exist in talking to some countries or finding agreement with others. So I think it translates because I can give them a very, eye-centric perspective of what it's like, and at the same time, hopefully inspire some of them to, get the skills to do that. One of the exercises that we did just last week was a simulation of a climate negotiation. So they assume roles and they have to pretend to play a country and go negotiate. And this model allows you to even calculate what temperature we're going with the pledges that they bring. So it's a very realistic, simplified but realistic mechanism to show them how difficult it is. And tomorrow I actually have probably the hardest class of all. At the very end, we do a class on optimism and hope, right? So after all the science that I have given them about how things are really looking very grim, I try to leave them with the need for finding optimism and how to generate that optimism so that they don't fall into the trap of just thinking that the problem is so big that they're not going to make a difference.
To end this conversation, I know the topic of climate change is overwhelming, but there's people trying their best to make a difference. So what would be your recommendation for people who are wondering, what should I do?
I have a great friend who wrote recently a piece in the BBC, and he said that optimism is not something you're going to find by scrolling through your social media. And I think it's a great quote because so many people attempt a very passive way of finding hope, and they just want to look elsewhere, outside, for reasons for hope, where the real true hope comes from actually doing something, and I would say surrounding yourself with other people that are doing something. So in my experience, people like the crew that I went to Antarctica on Homeward Bound with, or my scientific colleagues that I studied with, all of these people that I can look to as allies and people that are helping us get there are definitely my sources of hope. And whenever I feel like I need to take a break and I feel overwhelmed by the problem, I feel like I can take a day off and I can take the problem off my shoulders because I know there's this huge community of people that are, taking the problem on. So knowing that there are other people that are just as concerned as I am and doing something about it is my source of hope. And that is, I think, the only reason that I can go to these environments that are so critically endangered and so vulnerable and come back thinking that we can still save them and not fall prey to very dark and grim news in science.
Is there anything else you would like to add before we finish this conversation?
And I think especially an environment like UP's is a huge source of that kind of optimism because here you get to interact with students from so many places and you get to understand how climate change is viewed in other regions of the world and also understand what they're doing about it. So getting a much larger perspective and not getting lost in the details of one particular country and what one particular country is doing or not doing, and understanding this as a large-scale problem that we as a humanity get to address. So finding those common goals and those similarities between people that we think of as different are probably, another one of the big sources of hope for me.
Thank you for sharing all your experience. It was a great interview and I really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you for being so honest with your answers, and we hope to see you very soon at UPeace.
Yeah, it's a great honor, seriously, to be a part of this community and this university, and I really hope that I'm back as well.
So this is the end of this interview. If you enjoy it, please share it with your friends. If you would like to support us, remember that you can donate in our website www.ideasforpeace.org, and remember to follow us in Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter to know when we're going to launch the next interview.